Hello, hello. I'm Casey.
And I'm Fallon.
And this is
Render the Darkness.
Today we are going to be talking about Darlie Routier.
Never heard of her.
It's, yeah. So because of the content of this episode, I will not be adding a fact to this one.
Okay.
The content's just too sensitive.
Oh.
I just didn't think it was appropriate, so I just didn't do one.
Could have said that before. I was like, don't know her. I've never heard of her.
I mean,
no, I kind of feel like an ass.
No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't. It's fine.
Okay.
This is a truly, truly heartbreaking case, and I want to give a warning before I get into it. This case does contain discussion of harm against children.
Oh.
So if that's not something you're able to listen to, or if you're sensitive to that topic, I highly recommend you skip this case. This is going to be a 2-part episode, and both parts are fairly long, so just a heads up on that one. I just felt like it was important to include as many of the facts as possible. Also, on another quick note, there's going to be a lot of quotes in this due to the amount of witness accounts as well as the actual night of the events. I had to include them in order to give the full and fair depiction of the case from as many sides as possible. So you'll hear me say quote, end quote a lot in this one.
Okay.
That being said, let's get into it. Born in Altoona, Pennsylvania on January 4th, 1970, Darlie Lynn Peck was the daughter of Darlie Key and Larry Peck. She is one of 3. Her parents stayed married until Darlie was 7. A year later, Darlie's mother would marry again. Her stepfather's name was Dennis Stahl, who brought with him 2 other children. From all accounts, it seems like the siblings got along pretty well and were shoulders for one another through all of life's transitions, and one of those transitions would be the downfall of the marriage between Darlie's mother and Dennis, which I read in the book Bloodstained Justice, the Darlie Routier story written by W.G. Davis, which I will link in the show notes, that marriage ended due to volatile bursts over arguing that often became violent in nature.
Ooh.
After that marriage ended, Darlie's mother picked up her family and moved to Lubbock, Texas. This is where Darlie would go on to meet her future husband, Darren. I read that her mother is actually who introduced them, because her mother and Darren worked together.
Okay.
Darlie and Darren would instantly fall head over heels for each other. I read during their teenage years, Darlie started to display behaviors that could easily have been perceived as attention-seeking. I feel like that's important to include and note, so keep that in mind.
Okay.
Darlie was only 15 when her and Darren met. Long after meeting, Darren went to Dallas to go to college, and they stayed in contact while he was gone because she was still in high school. At that time, however, once she graduated, she too went to Dallas to be with Darren. By then, he already had a good job working as a computer technician. The couple would go on to become married in August of 1988. She and Darren would have their first son, Devin Rush Routier, on June 14th, 1989. Their second son, Damon Christian Routier, on February 19th, 1991. And their third son, Drake Routier, was born on October 18th, 1995.
All these.
Darlie and Darren. Yep.
Darlie, Darren, Devin, Damon, Drake.
Mm-hmm.
I really like Damon.
In 1991, the young family would move to Rolette, Texas, where Darren would work as a computer consultant and Darlie would stay home with the kids. Upon moving to Rolette, Darren would start his own company called Testneck, which by all rights for a while was pretty successful. And Darlie would later come in and help manage the books for the company. They lived a very comfortable lifestyle for a while. The more money the company seemed to bring in, the more outrageously lavish their lifestyle seemed to become. Within a year, the company had boomed. They would end up buying a 2-story home in a very prestigious neighborhood. The house really looked like a mansion from the outside. I looked at the pictures of it. It was an extremely lavish house.
Nice.
And whatever the couple thought it lacked in lavishness on the inside, they quickly upgraded.
Okay.
They put thousands of dollars into upgrading this home. But the home wasn't the only place they were spending their money. They were buying boats, expensive cars. They took incredibly lavish vacations often. It seemed like everything they bought big. Darlie seemed to have the most compulsive need to be the best and the biggest and have the best, and often it would be at an expense well above whatever their means actually were at the time. And again, that's not to imply Darren wasn't equally as guilty of spending above their needs, because he certainly was.
Yeah.
As for their neighbors, the couple were really well liked. Darlie's need to be liked was fruitful. She would bake cookies for the neighborhood. They had a game room in their house that all the neighborhood kids would come over to play in. If she knew of any of her neighbors going through any kind of a hard time, she would go above and beyond for them. She just, not only was she well liked, but also trusted by pretty much anyone who knew her.
Oh, okay.
By all accounts, during this time, Darlie was happy and was a great mother, but there was also this part of her that was obsessed with the material things and the image, and sometimes that seemed to come above all else in her life, including sometimes her children.
Well, that's not good.
Some of the neighbors, despite claiming to like Darlie, would make comments about the extremely revealing outfits she would regularly wear, flaunting her breast implants, which were like a ridiculous, I think I read they were a ridiculous size double E.
Oh, gosh.
Some felt it was a derivative of low self-esteem or attention seeking. There were reports on several occasions about how Devin and Damon would be left home alone. On top of that, it seemed as though Darlie and Darren's marriage wasn't always the sunshine and roses they wanted the world to think it was. There were many rumors suggesting there may have been some affairs taking place within the marriage, but they didn't want the image of them to be murked by it, so when Darlie would publicly do things like dance with men who weren't Darren at parties, Darren would become enraged. A lot of this spending and success, as well as the known problems the couple were having in their marriage, came before their third son, Drake, was born.
Okay, so it's been happening for a little while.
Yep. Unfortunately, it would seem that after having Drake, she would develop postpartum depression.
Oh, no.
This, as anyone who has ever suffered from this can attest, it can cause drastic mood swings. This was not only true for Darlie, but she seemed to also occasionally experience uncontrolled rage at times. She also reportedly was really upset about the weight gain she had experienced from her pregnancy with Drake. By 1996, their lavish lifestyle began to crumble. Darren's business began to fail. He owed over $10,000 in taxes, and they were over $12,000 in debt between both of their credit cards. Darren tried to pull them out of the hole. He started a second business, but despite the financial situation the couple now found themselves in, Darlie never seemed to recognize that they had a problem at all.
Oh, so she kept spending.
Yeah. She seemed to still continue to spend just as much as she always had.
That's not good.
It would appear that based on her diary entries from May 3rd, 1996, she was very much struggling on the inside. She left a journal entry that read, quote, "Devin, Damon, and Drake, I hope you will forgive me for what I am about to do. My life has been such a hard fight for a long time, and I just can't find the strength to keep fighting anymore. I love you three more than anything else in the world, and I want all three of you to be healthy and happy, and I don't want you to see a miserable person every time you look at me."
Oh, that's sad.
And that was the end quote. That was the end of her entry. Her intent was to unalive herself that day. She took some sleeping pills After she took the pills, I don't know who called who, but her and Darren spoke on the phone shortly after her taking them. He could tell something was wrong, so he rushed home. She claimed to be ashamed of her choice to attempt unaliving herself and vowed she would never do it again.
Okay.
After this happened, although she didn't seem particularly low in spirits at this point, but she wasn't back to like her old cheerful self by any means. Friends say she just kind of seemed neutral. She continued doing the things she had always done, spending, going out, and being just as lavish about her purchases and appearance as always. By late May, Tess' neck was basically completely in the tank. Darren wasn't able to personally profit anywhere near what he had been able to in the past, and Darlie wasn't getting paid at all by this point. On June 1st, they attempted to get a $5,000 loan so they could pay off some of the creditors that had started aggressively coming at them seeking payment, but unfortunately, the bank denied them the loan.
Ouch.
This seemed to kind of be the straw that broke the camel's back, for the lack of better words, for Darlie's already teetering mental state. So let's move on to June 5th. It was said that the boys, Devin and Damon, had spent time playing in the hot tub that afternoon. Afterwards, they grabbed some blankets and piled up in the living room to watch TV, and eventually the boys would fall asleep. So Darlie and Darren opted to let them sleep there for the night, and Darlie was going to sleep on the couch, so she would be downstairs with them, and also because she claimed that she was exhausted and needed a full night's sleep because, in her own words, she said she was a light sleeper, and Drake rolling over in his crib was enough noise to wake her up. Darren would go upstairs to sleep in the master bedroom and take care of Drake throughout the night. Darren and Darlie would go on to say that they stayed up late talking that evening. According to them, it was after midnight when they parted ways to go to sleep. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1996, an absolutely horrific event took place inside the Routier household. First, we're going to go over the 911 call made from within the house, and then we're going to talk about what was said to have happened according to Darlie and Darren Routier.
Oh, no.
At 2:30 a.m., Darlie would make a frantic call to 911 where she would exclaim to the dispatcher that someone had just stabbed her and her children.
Oh my gosh.
I will attach a copy of the transcript from the 911 call in the show notes for anyone that's interested in knowing exactly what was said, but Darlie can be heard through all of her hysterics over and over again, emphasizing how he went through the garage and making mention of how she picked up the knife and placed it on the kitchen bar and even made sure to say, "I wonder if we could have gotten prints maybe." She also can be heard continually claiming nothing had been touched and that someone came in the house and did this intentionally.
Okay.
The way she repeats it and in the context she repeats it, it almost sounds like she's doing her best to make sure they knew it was not her. I know that's a bold statement, but she says it like 3 or 4 times in one way or another throughout the call. It was only like a 5-minute and 44-second phone call.
So in the phone call, did you listen to the call?
I did not, but I read the entire transcript.
So how often did she mention her children?
She mentions the children, but it's more in like an, oh my God, they're dying, they've been stabbed, oh my God. More of that kind of a thing than it is specifically her children. She says a couple times that they're dead. That kind of a thing throughout the call.
Okay.
But her focus during that whole thing, as well as even after, once the police arrived, and that point forward, was very much on herself more so than the boys.
Oh.
And we'll get into all that more throughout the case as well. I just thought it just doesn't seem like a normal thing to be focused on.
No.
Talking about fingerprints and picking up the weapon and making sure they knew it was intentional.
Yeah, that's...
it seems like a really weird thing to specify in your moment of hysterics in your 911 call. Yeah. Especially a call that only lasted like 5 minutes and 45 seconds or 44 seconds or something like that. It wasn't a very long 911 call at all.
Yeah, because I don't think you would even be able to understand me if that happened.
Yeah, no. And you can clearly hear and understand her through the entire call. But the fact that someone came and entered the home specifically to kill the boys and attack her is what she kept claiming. And at this point, I just don't know how she deduced that that it was intentional that fast.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It just seems like that was a really weird, immediate place to go.
Yeah, that's... I mean, why would somebody intentionally come in just to do that to her and her two boys?
Well, and then when I get into the specifics later, it makes even less sense.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it makes a little bit more sense.
No, it makes even less sense. But I will say, just for the sake of being devil's advocate here for like a second, you never know what your brain is going to do in this type of a situation. And maybe that was her point of focus in an attempt to understand or process what had just happened somehow.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know. I just, for the sake of argument, without trying to be so point blank in my opinion, I will give the benefit of the doubt in that specific moment for what she was saying.
Okay.
But I have my opinions. There's definitely some different fairness points to look at and the call, just based on her reacting and processing the situation. So they apparently had a dog who somehow wasn't alerted by all the yelling and chaos or the supposed intruder during the attacks or any of the other events Darlie would go on to claim happened in her police interview. Apparently, the dog started barking once the police and the ambulance arrived, which definitely would strike many people as odd, and it actually ended up being one of the many factors that was part of the reason why people struggled to believe Darlie's recounting of the events. The dog was well known to bark at just about anything, which means the dog, in theory, should have been barking during the attack.
Right. So they should have been...
Correct. And her being a proclaimed light sleeper should have woke her up, you would think. And yet somehow, according to Darlie, she never heard the dog.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if her baby rolling around in the crib, can wake her up, somebody opening a door to get to her house, or somebody opening a window, or the dog barking, that should have, she should have just popped up.
Correct. Well, and there seems to be some confusion about whether the dog was upstairs or downstairs at the time of the actual attack. But either way, Darlie claimed the dog was upstairs and didn't start barking until people started arriving. And when it did, Karen went upstairs and retrieved the dog, which actually was verified that the dog did have to go upstairs and be retrieved. So it was upstairs. But in the 911 call, when you're actually listening to the tape, the dog doesn't start barking until 4.5 minutes into the tape, into the call, which is about the time that the first police officer arrived.
Okay.
So you're telling me that the dog wasn't disturbed at any point up until, even throughout her hysterical yelling on the 911 call up to that point? It wasn't until somebody specifically arrived at the house. So that would say to me that if somebody had broken into the house and there was somebody physically in the house, that dog would have reacted.
Right. So,
yeah. Again, I'm trying to be biased at this point, but it's suspicious.
Yeah.
Like I've said a few times, the 911 call took all of a time frame of about 5 minutes and 45 seconds, give or take. When the police arrived, they immediately noticed Devin, unfortunately, had already succumbed to his injuries.
Oh, poor baby.
Damon was still trying to hold on to life. He was breathing shallowly, but still breathing. Darlie, too, had sustained injuries. She had a cut across her neck that barely missed her carotid artery. I read it was only 2 milliliters away from her artery, and if it had hit that, she would not have made it. She would have died.
Wow.
She also had some minor cuts and bruises on her body. The first officer to get to the scene was Officer David Waddle. Once he recognized that Damon still had a faint pulse, he instructed Darlie to put towels on him and put pressure on his injuries to attempt to slow the bleeding, but Darlie did not do this. Instead, She was screaming the intruder might still be out in the garage. She then went on to give a description of the claimed assailant. She said he was medium to tall in height and was dressed in a black t-shirt, black jeans, and a black baseball cap. It didn't take long for more officers and paramedics to arrive on the scene. The second officer to arrive on the scene was Sergeant Matthew Walling. The paramedics' names were Jack Colby and Brian Koshak, whose names you'll hear again in part 2 when we talk about the trial.
Okay.
Before long, there was a plethora of officers, detectives, and paramedics who would begin to arrive throughout the night, as well as neighbors. Despite Waddle telling Darlie to put a rag on Damon's wounds and apply pressure, and her not doing as instructed, he would later go on to recount telling Darlie 3 separate times to put a rag on Damon's wounds and apply pressure, but she refused.
Wow.
That
should tell you something right there.
And it was noted that when the paramedics arrived, Darlie did have a wet towel over her own neck wound, applying pressure.
Oh, okay.
The police officers then decided to scope the house just to make sure the claimed assailant wasn't, in fact, still in the house. They followed the path of blood through the house. The blood path started in the living room and continued on into the garage. The garage was attached to the house. They took the path that took them through the kitchen into the utility room, which is the path she claimed the intruder had gone through. Although they did not encounter an intruder, they did notice the screen of one of the garage windows had been cut. They proceeded to check all the other rooms of the house, and it seemed as though if there was an intruder, they had already fled. With that information, the officers' focus shifted to the scene in the kitchen because that's the path the intruder had supposedly taken.
Okay.
Some of the things the officers noted right away was the suspiciousness of the scene as a whole. For example, the knife the intruder was said to have used belonged to the Routiers, which would mean this person broke in and either didn't have his own weapon or opted to use one of the couple's personal knives. They also noted the position in which the knife sat on the kitchen counter. It was setting in the opposite position it should be to match what Darlie had told them happened. Also, next to the knife was jewelry and a purse of pretty high value, both of which were untouched. It was also suspiciously determined that the knife used to cut the screen in the garage, it too came from the Routier's kitchen, but was not the same knife used to commit the attacks.
Oh, so we got 2 different knives.
So we have 2 different knives.
Okay.
It was instead determined to be a bread knife, and it was determined that the fibers from the screen that were found on it, and to add to the suspense of the bread knife, if I read it correctly, it had actually been placed back in the knife block.
Okay.
And we'll come back to the fibers on the bread knife in part 2. I know I said that kind of weird a minute ago, just to reword that so it sounds a little more sensical. Basically was just saying that the bread knife did have particles of the screen on it.
Okay.
But,
so the guy just opened the door from the garage, walked to the kitchen, grabbed it. Well, no. Because, I mean, how did he get in the screen with the bread knife if it was already in the house?
We'll get into that. Yeah. We'll get into how little sense that whole thing made a little later on.
I'll quit.
Nope, you're fine. So like I said, we'll come back to the fibers on the bread knife in part 2 when we talk about the trial. Investigators would actually find prints around the window in the garage, which we will again get into in part 2.
Okay.
The paramedics attempted to get Damon to Baylor Medical Center, but unfortunately the hospital was located across town, and sadly Damon would pass away from his injuries a short time after being put in the ambulance on the way to the hospital.
So if she would have done what that officer told her to do the first time, that little boy probably would have made it.
I mean, I'm not going to say that he probably would have made it. His injuries were pretty substantial. And a part that I don't put in here just because I thought it was a little too graphic is also it was noted that he had drug himself across the floor a pretty good distance from where he'd actually been stabbed before the paramedics arrived. So he had already exerted quite a bit of the energy he had left before they got there. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that he would have lived, but it would have given a much better chance that he might have made it to the hospital where better life-saving measures could have been taken.
God, I just.
Because that's kind of like a what if, and I don't want to.
Right,
What if?
right. Well,
but
I mean,
obviously, if you apply pressure to a wound, you're going to slow down the bleeding, and it's
Right.
going to prolong at least the time that it would take you to bleed out from the injuries.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, it would have gave him a better chance, like you said, to actually get to the hospital.
To possibly get to the hospital.
I mean,
it certainly would have prolonged that opportunity for sure.
Yeah, because I wonder how long he was laying there. Because I mean, he said it 3 more times altogether, or 3 times altogether.
3 times altogether, he asked her or told her to put a wet rag over Damon's wounds and apply pressure to slow the bleeding.
Yeah,
and she did not do it any of the times he told her to do it. In fact, she never attended to the boys at all. Darren did, but Darlie did not.
I couldn't be a cop.
So Darlie would be taken in a separate ambulance also to Baylor Medical Center, where she would make a full recovery and be released after just 2 short days.
You know what the cop should have done? He should have snatched that rag off her throat.
And put it on the boy.
It's been like, oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, that just...
It's infuriating.
Yeah.
It's absolutely infuriating. And it's not something that, it's just heartbreaking. I don't want to say that because that's a bold thing to say, but... my opinion, somebody who has any kind of maternal instinct at all, you don't give a shit about whatever's happening with you. Your instinct is to save them babies.
Yeah.
If there's even a sliver of a chance you could save those babies, you do everything in your power. And she made 0 attempt or effort.
That makes me want to cry.
Once Darlie, especially because obviously I didn't put it in my notes here, but man, if you look up a picture of those boys, beautiful, precious angels. But once Darlie was cleared for release from the hospital, the police wasted no time bringing her and Darren in for more questioning. So let me just tell you up front, Darlie's story changes many times, albeit what some could interpret as minor details, but still, the details seemed to change each time she gave a recounting of the incident.
Okay.
On June 8th, just 2 days after the incident, Darlie gives her full recounting of the events. Darren was questioned as well, and I will include his statements because they're equally significant in the piecing together of what most likely took place that night. But we'll also go over the changes in their stories when we get to part 2, because both of their stories changed. It wasn't just Darlie. Darren changed his story as well.
Oh.
So here is Darlie's statement. So everything I'm about to read is Darlie's statement and what she told the police during her investigation 2 days after the incident.
Okay.
The boys were asleep on the floor with their pillows and blankets. Darren brought me a pillow and a blanket from upstairs. Around 1 a.m., Darren and I decided to go to sleep. Darren turned off all the lights, but the TV was on. Darren told me that he loved me and would see me in the morning, and I told him I love him too. I asked him to make sure the door was locked on his way upstairs. He said he had already checked it, and it was 5 minutes later I fell asleep. Next thing I remember, Damon runs into my right shoulder and says, "Mommy." I sat straight up and saw a blur of a man between my couch and kitchen bar. I stood up and Damon walked behind me. I hear glass breaking. When I got to the entrance of the kitchen, I saw a man going into my utility room. I took a couple steps back and remembered lights were off. Went back and turned on lights. I started to walk through kitchen and noticed blood on my nightgown, about to my chest. Halfway across the kitchen, I saw knife laying on utility room floor. Instinctively, I went over and picked up knife. Doesn't seem like there was much blood on the knife. I went back to the kitchen and put the knife on the kitchen bar. Damon was still standing by living room wall. I walked into living room and saw Devin's eyes open and wounds on his chest. Devin wasn't moving and I started screaming. I went to Damon and began checking him and saw stab wounds through his shirt. I was hysterical, but I was trying to think. I told Damon to lay on his belly and I told him to hang on and be strong. Damon said, "Okay, Mommy." I ran into hallway to our entrance, turned on the lights and kept screaming, "Darren." My husband came out of our bedroom. He only had his pants and glasses on. Darren ran downstairs and we ran together into the hallway. Darren went to the left, into the family room, and over to Devin. The table by Devin was completely knocked over. I went to the right to the kitchen and grabbed phone to call 911. I went to second drawer and got towels. I could see Darren starting to perform CPR on Devin. I went to sink, and about that time 911 lady came on. I was screaming and got towels wet. When I turned around, I could see my neck slit in the mirror behind wine rack and said this to the 911 lady. I was screaming. I ran over to Damon, pulled up his shirt, and laid a towel on his back. I ran over to Darren and could see blood coming out of Devin's wounds when Darren blew into Devin's mouth. I didn't know what to do, so I held a towel on Devin's wounds. I was still on the phone while I did all of this. An officer came in, stood by my son Damon. I hung up the phone and dropped to the floor. I screamed for my husband to check on Drake, our baby. Darren did and came back and said he was okay. Darren went out front door to get neighbors. A second officer arrives and I tell both officers a man went out the utility room. The officers proceeded to go into kitchen into utility room. Darren came back in and said both our babies were dead. I fell down again and kept screaming who would do this. I was so dizzy and hysterical. 2 paramedics came in. One went to Devin, the other to Damon. I grabbed Damon's shirt and the paramedic wouldn't tell me he was dead. Then he took Damon out of the house. 2 paramedics came to me and I stood up and then passed out. Next thing I remember, I'm on the front porch and Karen is by my side. I thought I was dying and I made her promise to find the man that killed my babies and she did. Karen then went into the house. So many people were running in and out of the house and I felt so dizzy. I remember one paramedic telling me my necklace was stuck in my throat and he couldn't remove it. Then my husband asked me where my panties were and I realized they were gone. Next thing, I'm in the ambulance and I couldn't breathe and they put oxygen on me. Then I remember being in the ER and someone taking off my necklace and that's when I began to feel the pain. It hurt so bad. I begged them to make the pain stop and finally they said they had to operate and they put me under. End of her statement. Now I'm going to give Darren's statement that he gave on June 8th, 2 days after the incident, same day and time that Darlie gave hers. I will say ahead of time, some of the information he gave was redacted for some reason, so while I believe this is most of his statement, there are some parts missing, so there's going to be a piece or two that may not make sense, but I included it because it will still help to emphasize how his story also changed over time.
Okay.
So here we go. This is now Darren's statement. We were watching TV in the Roman room, which is what they called their living room. Watched MASH movie on HBO satellite. Baby Drake had fallen asleep about 10:30. I took him up to bed in parents' room, put blanket on him and turned out lights. I went downstairs to talk to Darlie. We talked about the boys not being able to start baseball yet because we were so busy with the baby right now. We talked about business, bills, and how Darlie was having a hard time with taking care of the babies today. Darlie said she wanted to sleep on couch because she would sleep better because the baby would keep her awake. The boys were asleep with pillows and blankets on the floor. Devin was asleep face up in front of TV, and Damon was asleep between couch and coffee table. By the couch Mom was on. So I went upstairs to get her a blanket and a pillow and came back downstairs to cover her up. We talked a little more about her going to Cancun with some friends across the street, and I gave her a kiss goodnight, told her to dream about me, and went upstairs around 1 a.m. I went and turned on the TV in our room and watched for 10 to 15 minutes and couldn't sleep with it on, so I turned over, took my eyeglasses off and turned the TV off. I couldn't go to sleep for a while, but finally I fell asleep. I heard a noise and then Darlie screaming loud. She was yelling, "Devin, Devin, oh my God, Devin." I woke up quickly and grabbed my glasses on the nightstand and ran downstairs as fast as I could. Going into the living room, I ran over to Devin laying on the floor where he was when I saw him last and kneeled down over him to see if he was hurt, and then looked at the coffee table to see it tipped over on him. When I looked again at his chest, there were 2 holes in his chest with blood and muscles piecing out. I slapped his face to get him to say or look at me. No response. I started CPR, and when I blew into his mouth, air came out of his chest. I blew 5 or 6 times and held my hand over the holes on his chest. Then, when that didn't work, I blew into one of the holes in his chest. I looked over at Darlie and she was on the phone calling 911. I ran over to Damon laying on the floor in the hallway between wall and side of couch. He had no pulse, but I could not see any injuries. Police came in and I told them that my babies were stabbed and she told them that he went out of the garage. I ran upstairs to put my pants on. I looked over and Drake was crying and I felt he was okay. I noticed my wallet on the floor and all I could think to do was go holler for help. I needed someone to help and the paramedics when they arrived. I went downstairs, ran out the house, and ran across the street to the names of whose house he went to were taken out of the statement, but he went to a neighbor's door. I banged 5 to 6 times as hard as I could until names were redacted. Comes to the door first, and when I told them that Devin and Damon were stabbed, they were in shock and ran over with me to the house, and that was when they were putting Damon on a stretcher. I knew that Devin was dead before I ran across the street, and Damon had no pulse, but paramedic carried him out in a blanket out the front door. I ran out yelling that we have to find who did this, and, name removed, told me that Darlie was cut too. I never knew that she was hurt yet. She had blood all over her from the neck down to the bottom of her nightshirt. She was standing in the doorway with the paramedics, said she needed to go to the hospital. So we helped her onto the stretcher, and she said, Darren, you have to promise me we will find this man. He killed our babies. I walked back into house, pushed my way through the police, and saw a knife on the bar in the kitchen with blood all over it. Name removed, went to garage and door to look at the window that the police had said he entered. And I went out of the house and walked across the street, and neighbors were there to comfort me and ask me about what happened. I sat for a minute on a curb and walked over to the ambulance where Damon was and asked paramedic was he alive, and they said no. I was in shock. Name removed, told me to go with Darlie in the ambulance. So I got in and they threw me out and said they needed to work. So then they asked me questions like my social security number, address, name, and I asked what hospital and no one knew. So found out where Darlie went and drove over to the hospital. At hospital, I was questioned by Detective Frosch for hours. End of statement. Did you notice the differences in events between the two of their statements?
A few.
Quite a few. Did you notice some of the important information you would think would have been in there but wasn't in either statement?
A little bit.
Yeah. Very, very bizarre, strange statements. We'll go over how their stories gradually seem to change and become more and more cohesive with one another's stories over time, and how the events of the night seem to change as well. There's also a pretty bizarre event that took place on the day of the funeral, and an event that took place a few days after the funeral that definitely contributed to the suspicions surrounding Darlie and the idea that she had possibly staged the entire horrific night.
I'm going with that, and I don't even know what's going on in part 2.
Well, in part 2, we'll definitely go over more details about the crime scene. We'll go over the trial. We'll go over the bizarre events and kind of what happened in the end and where it's at now.
Okay.
So that is the end of part 1 in this truly horrific story. And when our next episode comes out, it'll be the part 2.
Yeah, that made me tear up a lot.
Yeah, I cried several times doing this one. I will say ahead of time, if anybody goes to look into this case or reads about this case or anything like that, the crime scene photos are out there and they are very graphic. They are not blurred out.
Of the boys?
Of the boys.
Oh my gosh. See, I don't think they should that shouldn't be allowed on the internet.
So if you do decide to look up this case or look any further into it, I will give you a graphic warning ahead of time. You're going to come across some pretty horrific things that I wish I hadn't come across while doing this case. I didn't know I was going to come across that kind of thing when I started this case. It was a very emotional thing to come across. I'm trying to not cry right now. But yeah, so just be warned about that. If I don't recommend you looking it up, if that's something that's going to be mentally or emotionally breaking for you. So yeah, and I don't really have anything to add at the end of this one. It's a heavy case. So
yeah, it's pretty bad.
For those of you who were able to stay through it and listen, we appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for spending time with us. And as always, this is Render the Darkness.
Bye.